going live, Will, just so you know. And I'm just going to hit record. So, hello everyone. This is lesson 2 of the work experience, and I'm hoping we're live now. I can't see us on the thread yet. So let me just check this out. We've got new members joining as well, which is cool. Welcome. So let's see, are we live? We are live. So good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you. There is a little bit of a delay, so you might see me and Will both looking at the screen a little bit. So this evening, our topic is inequality and privilege. And the aim of the session is essentially an introduction to what does that mean. Tonight's session will help you to understand the inequalities and privileges of hopefully a broad spectrum of people and how they impact you on a personal, organisational and national level. So at the end of this session, you'll have a better idea of what inequality and privilege means. You'll also be able to analyse what are some of your own unearned disadvantages and advantages in terms of some of the things we're going to be talking about. You'll also be able to begin to recognise the importance of the question, are the issues of inequality and diversity that we see in the UK, but globally as well, are those issues systemic issues? So are they a problem in the system, or are they more about individual choices? And we'll also be questioning, you know, if we work hard, do we all have the same opportunity? And finally, we'll identify at the very end one small committed action to use your privilege in order to make a difference, because making a difference is what this group is all about. So my interest in this topic has grown over lots of years. As you all know, I was previously an engineer, and in the engineering and construction sectors, there is a total lack of diversity. By diversity, I am talking about the two big topics in those industries were always gender diversity, so not having a lot of women on boards, not having a lot of women in senior positions in the industry. It was also ethnic diversity around, you know, people from different backgrounds and how welcome and how easily they came into those industries. And I used to work on a lot of projects to try and improve some of those situations. Now, for over a decade, I have been listening to those industries talk about the changes that need to be made. However, I've not seen huge amounts of progress. And actually, when you begin to look at some of the statistics, some of them actually look like we've got worse, not better, depending on the source that you look at. So helping us to understand more this evening, I have brought in an old uni friend who has recently published a book specifically on this issue in the UK. So although we're going to be talking about the UK in terms of his work, we're also going to be looking at our own personal experiences. So it doesn't matter whether you are based in the UK, the US, Portugal, you will get a chance to reflect on your personal experiences too. So I would like to welcome Dr. William Shankly, Will to me, and introduce him a little bit more. So he is a postdoctoral researcher at Manchester University at the moment, and the book that he wrote was called Ethnicity, Race and Inequality in the UK, and it was a state of the nation kind of book, putting the facts together to see where we were really at. Would you say that's a fair description, Will?
Yeah, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute.
Okay, so when I first saw your book, one of the questions that came up for me was, wow, I wonder what got Will interested in this. And then a secondary question that made me feel a bit silly was, what's the difference between race and ethnicity?
Okay, so hi everyone, and thank you so much, Holly, for asking me to come and speak to you all today. I hope you're all keeping safe during this really unprecedented time. And I hope you're adjusting to life in or out of lockdown. I know I definitely need a haircut. I guess, well, the topic I want to talk to you tonight is ethnic inequality, but it's really hard to ignore the recent events that have been occurring in the US. So the hurt and frustrations felt most notably in the US, but also across the world, which has been sparked by the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in Minnesota. So I don't know if you found it really hard to kind of pick apart or distill and digest the weight of what's been going on and what it says about racial disparity in the US. But what I wanted to talk to you mainly about today is what's the situation in Britain. So when Holly asked me to come and give this talk, acknowledging those kind of debates, I wanted to very much focus this on Britain. And this kind of inspired the work which Holly's just spoken about, where me and my colleagues at the Centre of Dynamics of Ethnicity, based at the University of Manchester, we wrote a book about the current situation and talking points about ethnicity and inequality in Britain today. So I guess I firstly want, because it's hard to ignore, I wanted to touch upon the issues that have been occurring in the US, just because I guess they're current affairs and because this is kind of motivated this whole conversation tonight. A significant reason why people are so angry and frustrated, and this frustration is so palpable, is because there's a profound lack of trust in police to be made accountable for their actions. And this trust stems from the police not actually protecting or serving all communities equally, with many people perceiving that the police are on the side of the far right. It's going to take a lot of work and evidence to provide to people that this is not the case, particularly given cases such as the killing of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia and how long it took to indict and prosecute the killers. However, I don't want the main focus of this talk to be on police brutality, but focus specifically, as I said before, on the inequalities, ethnic inequalities in Britain across multiple sectors. So as Holly said, I kind of, like her, came to focus my research on this topic through a kind of very inverted way. So I got interested in ethnic inequalities when I worked for an organization providing legal advice to asylum seekers who were detained in immigration removal centres, which are the centres where people are detained whilst they await the decisions from the Home Office regarding their asylum claims. It struck me how in these cases, these people were, through many of the practices by people in these centres, dehumanised by practices of the state. Often they weren't believed and they had to essentially prove to the British Home Office that they warranted protection. So this gave me the first insight into issues relating to race, but also a lot of the people I spoke to and who I provided immigration advice to were people who I guess you'd want to link with the 2018 Windrush scandal, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, where many people in the 1940s, particularly from the Caribbean, migrated to Britain to work in various sectors of the labour market and were given the rights to settle here. But many of the people I spoke to within immigration removal centres had been detained unlawfully because they didn't have the papers to prove that they arrived at a certain time. And due to Home Office practices, they weren't believed. The problem here was that many of the countries which they supposedly came from refused to essentially take them back because they were born in Britain, but Britain saw these people as not belonging to the British state. So here it kind of sat at this really concerning juncture where certain groups in this country are continually believed to not be part of who we class as British society. So this kind of was the backdrop to make me return to university to pursue a PhD to look at how race, or in this case ethnicity, kind of created additional obstacles for some people above others. So firstly, I just want to make a quick differentiation. So in the US, researchers tend to focus on race, which is a concept that focuses on your biology, more specifically the color of your skin. And this has been a significant way different groups have been stratified in the US. However, in Britain, we focus more on the term ethnicity when talking about minority groups. And this is a more expansive and encompassing terms, which includes a person's language, customs, belief, and background. So throughout the talk today, I'll reference more ethnicity rather than race. I also want to quickly touch on the fact that Britain's past is very different from the US. And therefore, when we discuss these matters to do with ethnic minorities, the framings or the context is slightly different. So in Britain, a lot of our background is related to the country's colonial ambitions. As many of you might have seen in the news yesterday, there was a tearing down of a statue in Bristol, which was of a prominent slave owner. And this was essentially a symbolic mark of kind of objecting to the British state elevating the status of someone who was complicit in the transatlantic slave trade. So these kind of colonial connections shape who we consider as ethnic minorities in the country today. And if any of you have seen or filled out a equalities and diversity form, you'll notice that you're asked to tick a number of boxes of which ethnicity you self-define as. So these are usually, well, there's multiple ones, but these include Black Caribbean, Black African, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, but also what we call white minority groups, which are the Irish, the Gypsy and Irish travellers, as well as the white other. And as you can tell from these categories, there's very little logic regarding what these categories are. They're not really racial, or then not really based on any national kind of identification. So one of my colleagues who wrote the book with me, Professor James Nasri, discusses how these are relatively untheorized and arbitrary categories to define groups. So under Britain's colonial logic, Britain sought to benefit from its colonial exploits in places such as the Caribbean, across Africa and countries in Asia, as a source of cheap labor, but also a market for its products. As a result, colonial citizens were granted with a British subject status, which allowed them to move between empire territories, so anywhere in the empire. I guess you could say it was similar to how EU citizens are allowed to move freely around the European Union before we decided to sever our ties with the system. So in these early days, we can see how Britain essentially saw, I guess, racial whiteness, where the government used what's called vagrancy laws or homeless laws, which they used as essentially the building block of empire, where they allowed, I guess, poor white people to move to places like Australia and the US and Canada to essentially spread Britain's influence into territories across the world. So if any of you want to learn more about this, I will post a free link to the book which I wrote on this session after I finished. And if you look at chapter 2, there's a whole background to British immigration and nationality law, which I wrote with Professor Bridget Byrne. And this looks at how citizenship and notions of nationality have developed over time and how it excludes or privileges certain groups above one another. Okay, so I guess just to talk or clarify a bit more about what the book is about. So with 10 colleagues across the UK who research ethnic inequalities, we wrote a book that focuses on the current data or what we know about how ethnic minorities are faring, basically in 10 different domains of British society, ranging from education through to the housing market and political system. We wanted the book to be read by people from outside of academia primarily, and therefore we tried to really use the least amount of jargon possible, because these are, everyday experiences, and we wanted to make people enter the discussion, but also engage with some of the things we found. So again, as I said, I'll provide the link, and you can see also there's some, well, what I think is quite nice visualizations which kind of try to convey some of the statistics on each of these topics. So in my book, we talk about ethnic inequalities. And what we're referring to here are the restrictions to access and opportunities many ethnic minorities have in these different domains of British society. So if you look through the chapter of each of the chapters of the books, you can see that we look at how, differential access for different groups in the housing market, or differences in levels of employment or unemployment. So I guess just to give you a sense of some of these findings, I'm going to give you two examples. Firstly, from the political system, and then secondly, I'll move on to talk a bit more about what the, I'll talk a bit more about some of the statistics from the labour market. So in the political system in Westminster, there are currently only 52 MPs, which equals 8% of the total population of MPs serving in Westminster. Given that Britain currently has 14% of its population ethnic minority, you can see that 8% is by far lower than this proportion of the population. When we turn our attention to local government, in 2013, only 4% of councillors came from an ethnic minority background, and still in 2019, this had only grown to 7.5%. So we're still far off this kind of proportionate population of 14%, which reflects ethnic minorities' actual representation in the country. So I guess looking more into the labour market now, when we compared rates of unemployment, you can see that as many as 10% of Caribbean men are unemployed in the UK, and this compares to only 4% of white British men. When we look at women, we can see that 13.8% of Bangladeshi women are unemployed, whereas only 3.5% of white British women are unemployed. So there's multiple reasons why these differences exist, and in the book we kind of talk about some of them. These include hiring practices, where there's discrimination in the shortlisting process. And also this extends to language barriers and how easy getting interviews or accessing job roles is, as well as kind of how caring responsibilities affect different groups. So throughout the book, we provide examples and reasons why different ethnic minority groups are excluded or marginalized. We ask at different points what prevents ethnic minorities from gaining access or opportunities, or gaining certain level of positions in each of these sectors. So Holly asked me to briefly touch on privilege, and I guess in this case, what we're talking about here is white privilege. As you're probably aware, I'm not white, so therefore I often find it hard to define or clarify this as a talking point. But to compare issues to issues of gender privilege is comparable to, I guess, maybe a more understandable male privilege. So in many settings, there are barriers or lack of opportunities that ethnic minorities experience or are acutely aware of. And the fact is, for many white people, the privilege here is that they are unaware of these barriers or do not have to consider these barriers as they move around the social world. There's a particular researcher in the US called Peggy McIntosh, who likened white privilege to its wearer wearing a knapsack of privilege, which they carry around with them as they move around the social world. So briefly turning our attention back to the police, many minority parents in the US are forced to give their children what's called the talk, which explains to them how to conduct themselves around the police due to their disproportionate risk of any confrontations turning out negatively or disastrously. White families usually are unaware of this or don't have to do this. In Britain, we have a policy called Prevent, which also focuses on preventing terrorism across institutions, but has particularly been rolled out in schools, whereby teachers are asked to essentially spy or survey students they fear are at risk of radicalization. So this has led to many cases of discriminatory practices, whereby teachers and schools have particularly targeted South Asian children. And therefore, this has not only damaged the relationship between the minority communities and the school, but in some cases, it's forced minority parents to, again, have to teach their children about how to avoid being considered a terrorist or at risk of racialization. The same has only started to happen over people considered associated with the far right, but it's not something that necessarily white pupils or white students have had to confront with the same level of surveillance. So it's not necessarily having to think about, in this case, privilege is essentially not having to worry about some of the obstacles or some of the restrictions that may stop you from accessing a certain space or, applying for a certain job. So here it's the privilege of not having to do that. So lots of minorities in Britain experiencing everyday restrictions to their access or opportunities in these different domains. So I guess I just wanted to kind of finish this section on talking, I guess, from my own experiences of working in higher education in the UK, and talking about how lots of my colleagues who are from one of the white ethnic groups haven't had the same experiences. So when I first delivered my first set of seminars a few years ago to a bunch of undergraduate students who are primarily middle class and white, and they're studying the social sciences, when I walked in, there was almost a gasp and muttering with some of the things that they said were audible, saying that I couldn't possibly be lecturing in this seminar group because I didn't necessarily fit who they were expecting. So it made me feel like I wasn't deserving or I didn't have the right to be there, even though I have a PhD, I'm qualified to do this job. Essentially, my look or where I came from didn't match the profession of which I entered. And this kind of relates to how, for many of my white colleagues, they don't necessarily face the same, they're privileged because they don't face the same perception or restrictions on spaces that they can enter or not. So hopefully I've tried to explain that in the best way I can. Please feel free to send any questions along and I'll try a bit better to explain that. If I just try and pass you back to Holly now.
I'm here. Thanks, Will.
Ask anything.
Thank you for that. It was really great to just get a bit of an overall whirlwind picture there from you of, our past, our present, and then the personal experience as well. It really, I think for me personally, one of the things that I was never fully aware of was our colonial past and how that really has such a strong interplay with today. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about reading the book was that it talks about many, many incidents in recent history that have been incredibly scandalous, I would say, but they kind of get very quickly forgotten about. So I love that about the book. But just coming back to the personal experience point, I think that the Peggy McIntosh's original essays are absolutely brilliant for understanding what is inequality and what is privilege. So, and in fact, that was one of the first pieces that really hit me very hard, because having worked in a white male dominated field, I could totally relate to, because she makes this relation between basically as a woman working in a male dominated industry, there are plenty of equal opportunities in many, many ways, but it's the daily things and the subtle things that I think have the really big impact. So for example, on that topic of gender diversity, I couldn't choose to be in a room full of just women in that environment. I was often the only female in the room. People would actively change the way that meetings were managed because I was there as a woman. So, I'm not saying that was negative. I'm just saying that I felt it. They wouldn't swear, they would change their language, they wouldn't challenge me in the same way. I think sometimes for women as well, a certain thing can be said and men will make judgments on does that have an emotional driver or some other root cause. And what I loved about Peggy's essay was that she talked about being black and white, or ethnic versus white, and having white privilege from that daily perspective of, you know, if I buy a house in the UK or the US, I don't have to think if I, you know, are my neighbours, even if I'm in a nice neighbourhood, are my neighbours not going to like me, or am I going to be abused in any form, verbally, non-verbally, in any form, just because of my ethnicity or my race? I don't have that issue. That's a privilege that I have, that it's very easy to be unaware of.
I think you touched on a really important point. So even though I've been talking about ethnicity, of course, I'm a man. So lots of the things that you've just described about feeling that in the construction sector, you know, I wouldn't necessarily be aware of because I'm privileged by being a man. Mm-hmm. But also there are so many of these different, I guess, characteristics or identity facets which we have, which can create a space where we might not be, we might feel excluded or we don't belong. So whether you're a woman, whether you're an ethnic minority, a religious minority, whether you're handy capable, or you come from, you know, there's many different facets. And I guess part of this is about being attentive to or learning about what might be causing those microaggressions which you've been talking about, or how can we make people feel more welcoming or in these spaces, so you don't have to feel like people have changed their behavior, or to accommodate you, we should all be on a level playing field. Mm-hmm. So where we shouldn't have to feel like people have to change how they behave towards us.
Yeah, and I think, again, that touches on what you've just said, touches on another really important point for me, which is this idea of, I think as a white person, we don't necessarily feel that we have to understand other cultures. And I remember traveling to India for the first time, to a very rural area, and people staring at me and realizing what it must feel like to be a minority, because that was my first experience of really being the minority. And it's quite intimidating as a feeling, even though there's nothing harmful being projected to what that was being projected towards me at that time. I definitely felt uncomfortable and understood that what that must be like to live in day by day is actually, it has quite a big effect, I think, more than we realize.
I think there's just kind of collective fatigue that goes on, where because there's this feeling of difference or otherness that's carried out on a daily basis, it can feel tiring when you're always having to think about some of those obstacles or restrictions which you might face. Mm-hmm. Even if, as you said, you know, there may be nothing nefarious or about these kind of interactions or the way people are, I guess, looking at you, it's more just feeling that sense of, you know, that you're distinct, you're somehow different, and therefore, you know, you have to question, well, in this situation, how am I going to be received, or how is this going to play out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I can totally understand that. I think as well, I just want to bring the audience in on this a little bit, because I'm aware we've been talking for a good half an hour, and I just want to start to ask the question to the audience. You can either think this to yourself, or you can type in the chat box and just give your answer. But I'm wondering, do you see yourself as either disadvantaged or privileged, or perhaps something else? And the reason I ask this question, I know that our audience is particularly white, and I wonder whether they have any similar experiences that I've had, which is that within the education system particularly, I was often labelled as disadvantaged because I come from a single parent home. You know, growing up in school, I got tokens for milk, free milk, lunch tokens. And as I progressed, you know, I went to university. I was very privileged to have someone tutor me so that I could go to a good senior school. I don't think I'd have got in otherwise. I was then at university, because I was classed as, I was the first generation of my family to go to university, I was offered a scheme where I got a mentor in industry. And I know that without that, I wouldn't have made it to the end of my degree, and I would have fallen into the statistics that are there for everyone that's classified as disadvantaged, you know, you're less likely to finish your degree, you're less likely to come out with higher than a 2-2, you're less likely to go straight into a good and well-paid graduate job as well. And it was really only in starting to explore this topic that I realized I've been given this label of disadvantaged all my life. And so when I heard the words white privilege, I was instantly offended, because I was like, I've worked so hard. How dare anyone call me privileged, you know? And now I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so ashamed of that, you know, because I didn't understand what that term meant. So in the worksheet that you've got for this week, for those that are following along with it, I've given you a question, which is just to think about that and jot it down for yourself. What has your experience been? Have you been labelled disadvantaged, privileged, something else? Also, I've given you a little bit of space to write down in your own terms what you think inequality and privilege are. So perhaps, Will, you're far more educated on this than I am. What would you define inequality as? In your own words.
I guess it's the lack of access you have to places or spaces, institutions, versus the opportunities that you have, which create obstacles for you. Like in the next section, I'll be talking a bit about systemic inequalities to it kind of situates it a bit better if I explain it that way as well. But I think it's really hard actually to kind of define what inequalities are. But yeah, there are things that are out there which prevent you from the opportunities which you may have. And it's tied into this kind of myth of meritocracy in this country, where we're all on a level playing field, when that's actually not the case. There are things throughout Britain anyway that are there which creates obstacles for women, which creates obstacles for minorities, for people who are handicapable, you know, who from religious backgrounds, which all, you know, restrict them from achieving their true potential.
What about privilege? How do you see that? Because I know for me, I see as the easiest concept that I've heard to discuss both of these phrases have been unearned advantage or unearned disadvantage. And I see privilege as, I guess, having an advantage and not being aware of it.
Yeah, which is a perfect definition of privilege. It's not having to worry about some of these obstacles or restrictions I was just talking about that prevent some people from, you know, if we take the job market, for example, from deciding to pursue a specific career because maybe they have caring responsibilities, for example, or maybe they don't, you know, speak that language or something that prevents them from necessarily being on an even keel with other people. So these things you don't start from the same position. Some people are, as you said, given an unearned advantage, which they're very much not aware of.
I think as well, the word privilege is often used in quite a negative, or perceived as being used in a negative context, as in a bit like an accusation that often gives people a lot of fear, right? And actually, I think that privilege is an opportunity rather than something to be scared of. I think it's an opportunity to recognize the power that we each have, because let's face it, we're talking, you know, about a very small subsection of diversity here when we talk about ethnicity. I know that that is broad in itself. I'm not saying that it's small, but it, you know, there are many, many other issues, which I'll go on to talk about in a minute, but they present opportunities for us to learn more about people that are different than us and actually find the similarities and see where we can help and where we can make a difference. And I've been really surprised at how many opportunities there are to make that difference on a day-to-day basis, just by increasing my own awareness of what are the different areas of inequality and privilege, and also, you know, what are my personal experiences of that, and how can I use that to help others. So I'm just going to come back over onto my view for a little bit, Will, as I go into the next section, okay?
Sure.
So in the worksheet, again, I have put a list of different areas of inequality and privilege. I'm just going to read them out for anyone that doesn't have the worksheet, but I'd like you to just either mentally note, or if you have the worksheet, tick any areas where you think you might have either an inequality or a privilege. So this isn't all areas of inequality and privilege, it's just some of the common ones that I've been able to pick up and put into a list. So we have ethnicity, which we've talked about already today, and gender identity, which is far more than just male and female. We have sexual orientation, employment, because certain roles come with certain statuses, families' perspectives, our relation to class, in particular in the UK. I think this is felt, and everyone has a different view on it. There's the physical ability, whether you have the ability to use all of your body or whether there is any issues. There's our educational background. Having a degree gives you a privilege over other people in society. Money, religion, region where you live, housing, language, the neighborhood you live in, your gender, your nation of origin, your family's language of origin. There's so many dimensions to this. There's always more to learn. That's the thing that I've realized. And so what I'd like you to do now is just have a think, and if you can type it into the comments, I'd really appreciate getting some chat on this. Can you think of one way in which you've had an unearned disadvantage in your life? So, for example, an unearned disadvantage for me was that I came from a poor family, which meant that I didn't necessarily have the opportunities to travel that somebody else might have had. So that I lost out on a cultural level there potentially. Another example of an unearned disadvantage is being a woman working in the construction and engineering sector, just because it is mostly men and there are certain mindsets and ways of thinking and ways of behaving that come with that. How about you, Will? Do you mind if I just bring you in? Have you had any unearned disadvantage in your life that you can think of?
Disadvantage, I guess, obviously my ethnicity. We're talking about disadvantage now, aren't we?
Disadvantage.
Yeah. Disadvantage, yeah. So ethnicity, I think that's kind of about it in terms of the ones you just listed. But that's, I think, quite a major one, which I've obviously taken an academic interest in as well as a personal interest. But yeah, I think, as I was talking about in the example of when I started teaching, it's kind of this feeling that you don't belong in a place, or that you have to work harder to prove that you belong there. So that's kind of my personal experience there.
So we've got a few experiences in the group as well coming through. So coming from a working class mining village in the northeast and also being a woman in the construction industry. Yeah. Another one, poor upbringing upon returning to the UK, missed out on school trips as we couldn't afford them. And then there's the stigma of living in a rough area. Can totally relate to that myself. And I think it shows that the reason I start with disadvantages is because it shows us some of our similarities that cross the boundaries of race and cross the boundaries of ethnicity. Yeah, being a woman in the maritime industry, being turned down for jobs due to gender. Absolutely, another great example there. So let's have a talk about what's potentially the more difficult conversation, which is what are the unearned advantages that we have experienced? And this is just personal experience so that we can all get a little bit more of an understanding. I think for me, the unearned advantages that I've had have definitely been around being white. And the way that I think about that is I am unlikely to have been turned down for a job or not reached an interview stage just because my name looks foreign and people have made assumptions about that. I am unlikely to have missed out on a management opportunity just because I am from a certain ethnic background. Some of the statistics show huge amounts of disparity and disadvantage for people from particular backgrounds. I was reading yesterday about, I can't remember the source of it, but I'll provide it in the group afterwards. And it was somewhere between, people from ethnic minorities have to make somewhere between 70 to 90% more applications to get the job. And this was from a long-term study that was done with over 3,000 CVs and basically jobs being applied to, where what they did was they created identical CVs and cover letters, and the only difference was the name of people. And it showed like the white people, the people with the white names, were actually getting the jobs far more than the people who had foreign names. And there was nothing else that, you know, they'd planned it so there was nothing else that was different. Another unearned advantage was, I think sometimes being a woman in a male-dominated industry can always offer the opportunity to open doors. Not necessarily doors that are comfortable or, you know, that are nice, but certainly a man is more likely to take a meeting with a woman who's doing sales of something than potentially a bloke. Or they might go easier on a woman in terms of the conversation and the questions that are asked. So I think there are those privileges as well. Do you want to say anything on that, Will? I don't want to put you on the spot. I know I didn't talk about this before.
No, it's fine. I guess clearly I kind of am privileged because I'm a man, so I've been able to benefit from that. Speaking of the whole name hiring experiments, which we were just talking about, so I'm actually adopted, but when I came to the UK, my parents gave me a British sounding name so that I wouldn't be, I guess, disadvantaged because of my name, being obviously from a minority community. So Will Shankly is quite a anglicised name, whereas my birth name was Carlos because I'm from Ecuador. And it's very clear that from my name anyway that I would have, that would have been a kind of disadvantage. So I think I benefit from also having kind of a British sounding name.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How about anybody in the group? Is anyone willing to put any comments in for one way that you have had an unearned advantage? I think it was incredibly insightful of your parents to think of that. I know that one thing that I've realized for myself is I have friends from all different areas of the world. I think every continent. And because I have friends from those areas, and because I've had that level of exposure and culture, I guess are the right words, when I've been hiring for jobs, it hasn't crossed my mind about whether I should bring that person in or not based on anything like that. So to me, it's an issue that I don't see. And it's only when I've read the statistics, I've gone like, wow, so many people don't see it this way. And interestingly, I also watched a video today about the advantages and disadvantages of having diverse teams in business and in work. And we talk a lot about the advantages of it, and we don't talk a lot about the disadvantages openly. And I watched this video and it was saying, you know, it can be done incredibly well, but the leadership and the management teams have to have the right attitudes. And I think it's so easy to not realize that you have a racist attitude, or not realize that you have an unawareness around a set of issues. And it got me thinking a lot about how each of us in work can share this knowledge and can educate other people. You know, if you're white, educate other white people. If you're a man, educate other men. And it reminds me of the fact that we spend a lot of time in industry talking about how we need to, you know, basically put things in place to help people who are disadvantaged. But I don't think I've ever heard a conversation around how do we reduce the privilege, or how do we use the privilege in a positive way. And I think that if I had one wish for my previous industry, construction and engineering, it would be to start asking those difficult questions around the unearned advantages that they have, and the unseen things that are happening within their businesses. So I'll just come to a couple of the comments from the group. Unearned advantages. Being white, until recently, I didn't understand what white privilege meant. Can totally relate to that. Definitely being white, as I didn't realize until my later years, when I was working overseas. Also, just the fact that I was born in the UK. And one of the questions we have is, how do you overcome the unconscious bias? I think it's a really great question about how do we overcome unconscious bias. This is something I know when I'm studying a degree in career development. Unconscious bias is a topic we've touched on, but not necessarily in huge amounts of depth. And it's a question that always comes up, because the studies show that, you know, if you look at gender diversity, for it as an example, this, and I use this just because I know the stats off the top of my head, children have decided on what is for them and what's not before the age of 7, is what the latest stats are showing, which really shows how endemic it is to have these biases. You know, I'm sure you can probably give us some examples from education, Will. I can't think of a specific one from your book, but I know from other things, you know, when you look at the history books, it shows a very white-sided story. It doesn't show all sides of the stories often. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think because, well, you're talking about the history. When we teach history in the UK in state education, it's a very white history, and we fail to appreciate, as I was saying earlier in the talk, about the true role of Britain's colonial past, and the role that minority communities played in, who served in the army, for example, how they helped build, you know, what we understand to be a great British Empire. And, you know, so some of these things which we assume is a very white history is also embedded and infiltrated by the role that different groups from all around the world have played. And I think there's a whole movement about decolonizing the curriculum to expose a lot of the narratives of people from the Caribbean, people from South Asia, from Africa, have played in the formation of the modern British state.
I mean, I remember in school being from the Wirral near Liverpool, for anyone that doesn't know where the Wirral is, learning about the slave trade and being shocked to realise that that's what that city is built on. And I think it definitely had a positive influence on me to have seen that, but I still think it was very much told from the white perspective. I don't recall, and I might be totally wrong and doing my history teacher a disservice here, but I don't recall the experiences of Black people and how that, particularly linking it with modern life, that was the bit that was missing for me. of how we are today and how that shapes our society. But coming back to the point of unconscious bias, do you have anything to add on that?
I guess some of the problems with unconscious bias experiments or training is that it kind of acknowledges that unconscious bias is there, but what it doesn't do is offer a remedy to resolve it. So I guess lots of the work should actually be about people being more interested and informed about the subject. So acknowledging that unconscious bias is there, but as you were talking about a while ago, is learning more from other people. If you've got that privilege, then try and put yourself in the shoes of the other, to try and find out what their experiences are like. And whilst you may not be able to completely remove this unconscious bias, at least you can be more informed about some of the obstacles or restrictions which might confront some of the people who might be on the receiving end of that unconscious bias.
I think the word unconscious bias is a big clue to how do we overcome it as well, because it's things we are unconscious of as opposed to things that we are conscious of. And I think that's where I come from, this perspective of, we talk about giving opportunities to disadvantaged groups, but we don't talk about the need to be more conscious of the cultural differences, the challenges that different parts of our society face. And it does go beyond race and ethnicity. It's sexual orientation, it's gender, it's disability or ability. It's, the list goes on. So we've got, definitely agree we need to talk about it more in the group. And I think hearing so much about white privilege is shocking people out of their bubbles. And do you think there is a risk that there will be even more divide in the future from this? The key message seems for us to educate ourselves, but how many people will actually do that? What I'm picking up from the messages on social media are, don't talk to those being discriminated against about what you can do about it, and go read some books. I mean, I can certainly echo that experience. That is certainly what I'm reading and seeing myself. I'm not so sure about the don't talk about it, but I think this is part of the uncomfortable conversation, in that you don't know if you're going to say the wrong thing. You're not educated enough to have the right conversation, and you don't want to be made to feel humiliated or stupid for not knowing that, because it is an unconscious bias or an unearned or an advantage that you're not necessarily aware of. So there is this difficultness about the topic. You look like you're going to add something there, Will.
I think more it's about wanting to start the conversation, or being open about the conversation. Yes, some of these issues are difficult to talk about, but I think ignoring the issues is even more destructive. It's the same as if we're talking about the gender kind of inequalities and asking men to become more aware of women's, experiences of the social world. It's kind of thinking about, for men particularly in this sense, it's asking them to be more open to listening, to appreciating that they can't, stand in women's shoes, but aware of that they're open to engaging in the dialogue. And the same is true within the whole, white versus ethnic minority debate. Yes, obviously there are people who might not want to talk about it, but at least people are more open to listening about the debates which are going on here.
I think that's such an important and clear point. What I'm reminded of as you say that is years ago, when health and safety was really coming into its place within the construction industry, one of the things that was a really big message is we have to have the conversations. We have to have the uncomfortable conversations and situations. And instead of hiding this stuff, we have to actually actively talk about it and actively share where we go wrong, was the message in health and safety, in order to essentially be more aware of what's going on, be more aware of what the issues are, what's really happening, what different people's experiences are. And I wonder whether there is a model that could be used within business that would support that. I know some of the people in the group might be able to relate with that in particular. As a way forward, potentially there's a good comparison with health and safety when that first came in with conversations and with toolbox talks in the construction industry, which is where, before doing a job, you go in and you talk about the issues around the health and safety and things that might need to happen. Maybe we need to be having those kinds of conversations and taking those kinds of actions in business on a more regular basis.
I feel that, so just to kind of add in here, so one of the chapters which I wrote in the book with a professor called Sarita Malik, and this looks at the cultural industries and how they've tried to implement diversity there, but not necessarily done it in a way where it's actually had any true lasting effect. So in the book, we look at both the BBC Equality Information Report, which was conducted in 2016, but we also looked at Channel 4's 360 Degrees Equality Strategy. And here it was kind of a industry-led approach to diversity. But one of the problems is they used the incoming 2010 Equalities Act to kind of implement what they thought diversity was. And this included, gender diversity, ethnic diversity, the experience of religious communities and stuff, all into one kind of static, diverse term. But the problem is this failed to actually incorporate some of the specific restrictions or obstacles different groups faced. So it was kind of this too broad concept, essentially, to have any lasting implications. But in terms of ethnic diversity, the policy here, both channels, public broadcasters, thought that if they just increased the ethnic diversity of the workforce, this would be enough. But what they really wanted to achieve, well, what people wanted to achieve, was to have more diversity in the content of the shows which they were producing. And they were under the faulty assumption that diversity in the workforce translated to diversity in programming content, when this is actually not, an established connection. So whilst, yes, they've made small advantages by developing programs to increase diversity in, directors of programs and who, are works at the BBC, for example, there's not really been any programs to change the content of public broadcasting, because still in the senior positions are mainly white, middle-class men. So whilst diversity is really kind of growing at the lower ranks of the broadcasting organizations, it's not spilling over yet into the decision-making of these organizations or into the shows which they develop for their audiences.
Yeah. So, I guess the question that we all end up asking ourselves is, well, how can we take action to start to bring these changes? And, at the end of your book, and I haven't quite finished the last part yet, it presents a rosy vision. I remember reading at the start, that's where we'll get to at the end. So is there anything you can share from that you see as, I really liked this concept of, it's about having that better vision, really.
I guess go back to the last thing you were talking about how do we change things, having these kind of uncomfortable conversations. So across all these different sectors and domains of British society, it's about having these, open dialogues with different communities, looking at what they actually, some of the obstacles they face, what they want in, for example, the housing market, what things they see as preventing them from, climbing up the occupational ladder and then actually implementing policy that's actually built on empirical evidence, rather than just assuming this is how we'd produce diversity on a institutional level without engaging all the different people involved in this.
Yeah, I know that on the topic of gender diversity, I've been in so many roundtables where men have been putting forward the solutions, and I remember having one quite intense discussion with a group and saying to them, how about you ask the women? How about you understand their experiences? And I think that goes for all of the diversity issues, really.
It's interesting because I'm actually working on another project at the moment where we're looking at how to increase the diversity in the Ministry of Defence. And for years and years and years, the Ministry of Defence have been trying to understand why there is not more diversity, ethnic diversity within their ranks. And again, it was a case of what you've just been explaining, a group of primarily white men trying to unpick what was going on here. And it seemed like a novel concept when someone suggested, oh, why didn't you actually ask some minority people themselves why they won't sign up to join the army or the Air Force or the Navy? And it seemed almost like a revolutionary kind of thought to ask the people that you're trying to attract to join themselves. And then what's come about is, I don't know if any of you have seen the recent Ministry of Defence TV adverts, where it shows like a happy woman who's, you know, holding a gun, fighting somewhere overseas, and then you've got an ethnic minority person doing this and this. So it's like they're slowly trying to incorporate diversity, but maybe not doing it in the right way. And you almost need a fundamental overhaul of how they approach this in order to actually have something tangible and meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm reminded of the Navy adverts that they started doing for women, and they start to show things from, you know, there are differences in what motivates a man versus a woman, regardless of ethnicity. There are differences across ethnicities as well. And I've been very interested in what motivates different groups. And interestingly, many of the, I think what the forces adverts have done very well is they've tuned into what those target groups are looking for to achieve for themselves. And I think as well that one thing that I notice in many adverts like that for various jobs and companies and organizations is there's still this message of, if you work hard, you can achieve, and you've got the same opportunity as everybody else. And I think that's certainly something that the forces put across, and yet the statistics show otherwise. And this is that idea of, you know, a meritocratic society. So for anyone that doesn't know what that means, can you share what a meritocratic society is, Will?
So I guess in the UK, probably in many countries across Europe and in the US, we're led to believe this, that if we work hard enough, or, you know, work hard enough, study hard enough, we'll all have the same equal access or opportunities regardless of our start in life. And this is, so you'll probably see loads of diagrams or pictures of everyone on a level playing field, but in reality, this is not the case. And this is kind of relates to some of the things we were talking about before about unearned advantage and stuff, which actually positions some people at a slightly higher, or, you know, in a privileged position compared to others, which makes their opportunities easier to obtain, or they're like more easily able to access certain jobs or industries which may be more difficult to reach than others.
Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like, you know, the media story is always, you know, when someone isn't doing that well for themselves, the media story is often, oh, well, they haven't worked hard enough, or, oh, well, you know, they're obviously just not on some level doing well as a human being. When that's really not the case. So one of the questions that I've put in the worksheet is, do we actually live in a meritocratic society? Because I think it's so important to recognize. And, you know, I'm going to suggest that everybody this week looks out for how many times you see this message in the news, in media, in the shows that you watch, in the books that you read, which tells this dialogue of we're all equal and have equal opportunity, and life is what you make it. And whilst I absolutely agree that life is what you make it, you know, you have your fate and you choose your destiny, and you do what you the best you can with what advantages and disadvantages you start with. But I do think that some people go against all the odds and do very, very well, and are positioned as, you know, proof that this isn't going on in society. So an example of this is I saw a conversation of someone saying, oh, well, you know, Oprah's done really well for herself. She's one of the biggest names. So how can you say this, you know, this goes on? But you can't take a small subset and use them as the proof. You have to really be aware of the fact that they've worked really hard. They've done very well for themselves. But there's a lot who aren't that fortunate too. And there's a lot more that we need to be doing. So to close this evening, our final question is, I'd like you to have a think about what is one action, no matter how small or how big, that you can personally take to use your privilege to change some of this. It might be having a conversation with someone I was going to say at the coffee machine in work, but we're not doing that with COVID. So, you know, mentioning it on Skype, sharing it with a close friend. It might be, you know, if you're in a position where you work with businesses, or if you're in a leadership or management position, it might be something more bigger. Maybe there's some ideas that have sparked for you from the conversation today. So I invite you this week to think about as well, building a fuller list of your unearned disadvantages, and in particular your unearned advantages, because when you really know what your privileges are, the things that advantage you that you haven't earned, it shows you where the opportunities are to make differences, to educate yourself on things that you don't know about. So do use the list that I've shared, and I'll share a link to the Peggy McIntosh article as well, so that if you do want to have a read of that for a little bit of inspiration for writing your own list out, you'll be able to do that. And finally, just before we close, I'm going to ask the audience, do you have any final reflections of what was it like to share these experiences and have this conversation tonight? What was that experience like for you? Were you nervous? Did anything come up for you? Did you not want to add to the conversation because of fear? Whatever it is, we'd love to hear a little bit more about it. And I'll just invite Will to just sum up any final thoughts that you have based on the conversation that we've had today.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I think with all these things, it's really great to start having a conversation about these things, regardless of how knowledgeable you are about the subject or how difficult you feel that these conversations are. It's good that more and more people are having these conversations so that it starts a national debate about some of these issues. And it also gives people more chance to engage with these things. So as we were talking about just then, there can be some substantial change in, you know, the places we work or our schools or where we live, which can benefit all of us. And I think that can only be a good thing.
Thanks. So yeah, I'm so appreciative of you joining the conversation and sharing all of your wisdom and amazing research and your brilliant book. I would recommend, I know, Will, you said you will share a link to the book. If you have an interest in this, to everybody that's watching, please do have a read. I think for me, when I read through each of the sections, the penny dropped for me that what I hear in the media is very different to the reality of the situation. And I think that's the greatest gift of this book, is that it really does sort fact from fiction within the context that it speaks to. And I'm just going to have a quick look at the comments to finish off. So we have, thanks so much for this. It's hugely insightful. It felt like a safe space. So thank you for creating the opportunity. I think it can make you feel vulnerable admitting or voicing some of the unearned advantages and disadvantages. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so hard to admit those things. Like, we don't want to admit that actually we have power that other people don't have, and that we may not have earned everything that we've got. It can be a little bit of a difficult pill to swallow. And I think, and I remember when I first read the article by Peggy, I remember having a bit of a cry because I was in shock at my own obliviousness. And, you know that this stuff affects my friends as well. So I was really, really moved by some of the stuff that I read in that. And I think it's good to be vulnerable, and it's good to recognize that when we can be vulnerable, that's when we can start to change. That's when we can start to be honest as well. Because I think vulnerability comes with the risk of being wrong, or the risk of being humiliated or put down. And actually, when we shy away from that, we are, on the topic of race and ethnicity, we're doing a disservice to so much of our population, of our human race. And I think it's a great point that you've made there about the vulnerability. So a massive thank you to everyone for your questions tonight. I think it's provided some brilliant debate. Do use the worksheet. Do feel free to drop me a message in the week. Do feel free to email me if you'd rather do something privately. My email is holly@evolving.careers. And if you have any questions for Will, or would like to ask him anything further, I can always pass those on as well. And don't forget, on Thursday, we will come back for about 15 to 20 minutes if anybody wants, where I will field those questions, and we will just see if anything else has come up for us, any further reflections in the days that follow, because I'm sure it will spark a lot of things, and you will start to notice things over the next few days that you haven't before. And finally, the biggest thank you to you, Will, both for your book, for all of your contributions, because I know that it goes far beyond, what we see in this book. You've been involved in a lot of other research, and in particular for coming to this group and talking to us.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful insight, and I'm so grateful to you. So thank you very, very much. And on that note, send Will some love, give us some thumbs up in the group. Do let him know what you thought of this evening, and I look forward to catching up with everybody on Thursday. Right, cheers, Will, thank you very much, and bye guys. We'll go offline now.